Hello.
Hi.
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 Hello.
I'm curious about.
I'm curious about
Building open, authentic, loving relationship.
I'm curious about jealousy.
I'm curious about polyamory.
Does it just mean that you're fucking all the time?
How can I tell my parents that my partner is already married?
I'm curious about.
How do you know when you're too busy to have another relationship?
I'm curious about dominant and subordinate relationships.
I'm curious about sexual health.
How can relationships evolve with people as they grow and change?
I mean, I generally have low RAM. I have very low RAM. I'm like a low RAM, high processor. My brain kind of works that way. Jackie is like high RAM, like super high RAM. She can hold on to like so many details, so many plates at the same time, live, like ongoing. It's crazy. It's like it's like another.
It is true. It's like a computer, but it's exhausting. Because then at the end of the day, someone's like, "What do you want to eat?" And I just like my computer like shuts down because it's like,
it's like I'm out of decision-making capacity. It is spent.
Exactly.
Hi, welcome to the Curious Fox podcast. This podcast is for those who challenge the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. My name is Effie Blue.
And I'm Jacqueline Misla, and today we're excited to welcome back the incredible Steve Dean. According to the New York Times, at the time of this recording, the total death rate from COVID in the United States is among the worst globally. And while most high-income countries now have relatively small numbers of cases and deaths each day, the numbers in the U.S. continue to rise. And as COVID-19 begins to surge in states like Texas, Florida, California, and Arizona, it becomes increasingly clear that our life will not be returning to the way it was anytime soon, if at all. And this reality has meant that everyone from business owners to parents to partners to those who live alone have to now strategize around how they will not only survive, but thrive in the coming months. And so on today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Steve about how to establish a QuaranTEAM to support us through the next phase of this pandemic. Steve Dean is a New York City-based dating industry consultant, dating and relationship coach, and a community builder. Through his work, he creates moments of groundness and connection where people can share their stories, feel seen and heard, and become inspired to build new friendships, startups, and movements.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hello. This is wonderful to be on the podcast today. And I'm kind of excited to dig into this because this is something that I literally have people come to me every day, every other day saying, help, how do I do this? I'm lonely, I'm scared, I don't know what to do. And so at first, I also had no idea what to do. And I had some inclinations. I got my QuaranTEAM started very early, which was extremely lucky. And yeah, I'm happy to dig into this together.
Nice. Thank you this is a hot topic for sure. And I think you're the perfect person to talk about this. So welcome. Before we get into QuaranTEAMing, I want to check in with you. We are friends. So I'm interested in what's going on with you. So 5 months into this global pandemic, how are you doing with your quarantine, social distancing, and all the other ways our lives have changed? What does life look like for you now?
Yeah, I think it's important from my perspective, like to understand my story, is that for the last decade, I've been living nomadically and spending pretty much almost every day or every other day at someone else's space, whether on their couch, in their bed, cat sitting, dog sitting, constantly seeing people, hosting events. So I haven't been able to quarantine from the world and from general like mountains of social energy for almost a decade now. And so when I guess March 1st came about, that was when I was running an Airbnb with guests coming in from, guess what? From China, from Korea, from Japan, from Italy, from Spain. And at that point, I decided like, oh, pandemic's happening. This needs to end. This cannot continue. So I immediately left that apartment. And I actually began a QuaranTEAM with my partner, who I was seeing at the time, and I'm still seeing. And ever since March 1st, so now it's been about, almost 5 months maybe, that we've now been together as a duo. But as a polyamorous duo, it makes things a little more complicated because I had several other partners that I, at the time, around March, had to make the decision of, where am I going to go? Am I going to see these other partners? Is there any expected frequency that we might see each other as the quarantine goes on? And ultimately, I managed to form a slightly larger QuaranTEAM. I think it's now 6 others. And over the last couple months, we would do monthly like pilgrimages to each other's apartments just to be able to spend some time with human contact. We've all been socially distanced. We have all of our rules in place for how we engage. And so it feels really good to be able to do that. But the main thing I've been thinking about, just having spent so much time surrounded by people, is that I finally got some much needed solace, some ability to just be alone and appreciate that and do some really deep personal work that I haven't been able to do in years, just because I've been way too much up in other people's lives, connecting people everywhere. And so it's been so nice to just relax a bit and be like, indulge my inner recluse.
I hear you. I definitely found that too. The first month, I was like, oh, this is good. I can stay at home with no FOMO. Nothing else is happening. I had just moved into a new apartment. So I was like, I'm going to nest. I'm just going to there's nowhere else to be. I'm going to take my time. That's kind of where I started for sure. It's changed since, but that's where I started for sure.
One of the things that I think was interesting is last time we checked in with you, Steve, it was probably March or April. It was really early in the quarantine, and you came on the podcast and you did a workshop for us around online dating during the time of quarantine. And what I appreciated in that time was that you were saying that it really gave us an opportunity to be more creative. And you gave us some fantastic tips. So you should go back and find the other Steve Dean interview that we did around online dating and updating your online profile and how to create really interesting online dates. And it sounds like part of what you were sharing is that there was this time for solitude and time for us to explore and time for us to be creative and time for us to connect and reach out via the internet. And now it's time for us to figure out some other strategies because we know that this is going to be a much longer time away from each other than we anticipated. And so I just wanted to note that shift of our last conversation was how do we gauge online? And now we're talking to you about stepping away from our computers and how can we safely continue to engage with each other?
Yeah, it's been quite the shift. I will say that the online and virtual engagements have actually gotten a lot better. Like the quality of offerings, it's going up because we have so much entrepreneurial creativity suddenly flowing in. These people are home, they're lonely, they are creative, they know how to build digital and virtual products. And so the things that I've seen coming out, to the credit of what we can do virtually, I've seen virtual sex parties in which you can go in different Zoom rooms and get to experience different kinds of intimacy and meet different people in the span of a couple hours. I've seen virtual sex clubs where it's almost like not even a sex club. It's more like an intimacy club where people can have, book clubs together, but it's around topics of intimacy. There's naked yoga. It's almost like an entire community tied to virtual intimacy. I've also seen virtual festivals where you can go meet new people and actually go explore different, once again, it's like rooms, but they're experiences. One can have, a live performer happening only during that moment. Another time it can be like a ball pit where you can just hang out and play around with other people who happen to be looking around for something to do because they didn't want to listen to music at that moment. So between festivals and sex parties and things like that, there's a lot of new ways to engage with others virtually. And that said, I still talk to plenty of people on a regular basis who are like, I am done with the virtual. I hate screens. I am becoming screen phobic. If someone sends me a message, I run. And they have like piles of messages just sitting there that they don't know how to address because it's too much. And so what they're hoping for is, how do I get oxytocin back into my life? How do I get touch back into my life? For the people who still have the ability to bring others into their spaces, into their world in a safe way, then there are certainly new strategies that are coming out from, all over. It's really like wherever you're located, if you have the ability to live close enough to people that you want to bring into your QuaranTEAM, then there's certainly now practices available to us to begin doing that. And even more importantly, coming from a background of poly and kink, these things aren't new. This is something that's been standard practice in poly for polyamorous individuals. Contact tracing, asking questions about where you've been, who you've been with, when you've last been tested, what are your standards, what are your fears, what are the general ways in which we can engage together in the short term and the long term. All of these questions are just par for the course of standard day-to-day polyamory. And yet now everyone who's trying to QuaranTEAM is suddenly finding themselves learning essentially what has been poly lingo for years or decades even.
For sure. I mean, and that's definitely something that I've noticed. I do notice that how there are definitely waves of knowledge and wisdom and practices that are, very much grounded in polyamory and people who practice polyamory that translate into the mononormative culture and improve. I've never heard of a good strategy that works for polyamorous people not work or improve monogamous relationships. And this is not about making monogamous relationships non-monogamous, but just the advice that goes towards a poly or a non-monogamous relationship works wonders in a monogamous relationship as well, And then there's like extra stuff that, because if you're polyamorous, especially if you're polyamorous, you get to practice these things. You get to practice having difficult conversations. You get to practice communication more than a regular relationship. You get to have, like you said, sexual health conversations. So we're used to getting up in each other's business when it comes to health and about how you take care of yourself, how you take care of, your body, what are your risk tolerances. Like you said, these are long, grounded conversations that polyamorous people are having for a long time. And look, it translates to mononormative culture and it improves it.
I would say that there's the cool discrepancy there between poly and standard monogamy is simply that the things that you get, like you frame it in poly as you get to have these conversations as though it's like this super wonderful thing. But I think a common complaint within poly is, oh my God, my whole day has just been spent negotiating boundaries across partners. And
too much talking.
It's not necessarily, it can be a lot of talking and not a lot of all of the other things.
Right, that people believe that it is, that we're just having sex with everyone all the time. We're actually just looking at our Google calendars and figuring out scheduling and conversation all the time.
Exactly. Google Calendars, eye gazings, and conversations is really what polyamory is mostly about.
It's kind of satisfying. Like I've enjoyed the process of diving into these multi-layered conversations. And I think the challenge of monogamy is that you don't oftentimes get to have the same depth of conversation because you can assume things. You can assume in monogamy that your partner's not going to be sleeping with other people. One might hope. But when in non-monogamy, you can't assume that all of your needs are going to be met by default. Like the default is that you have to come to the table with awareness of what your needs are and the ability to express them and the recognition that you may not have them all met by this particular person. And that's fine because you've already taken off that brake, that stopping valve, so that you can have other people in. If one person can't meet your specific kink needs, then they will fully encourage you in a healthy non-monogamous relationship to let's go to the drawing board together. Let's see how we can get this need met. Is it by another person? Is it by a device? Is it by some other type? Maybe it's through a type of meditation or a guided activity. There's so many ways of getting our needs met that I just really like how I have a pretty privileged perspective as someone who's been poly for about 10 years, that these are conversations that I'm just used to now and that I almost imbue them into any relationship that I'm going to have. Whereas I think people coming from a monogamous background, there's just a lot to still learn, especially when if you're going from monogamy to cohabitation with someone you may not be in a monogamous relationship with, or even if you are, like there's just so many additional conversational layers that we don't necessarily get exposed to in the monogamous world.
Yeah, I think because monogamy, like you said, I often say comes with default settings, right? It comes out of the package with default settings that you can lean on. And because of that, I think we are not in the habit of creative problem solving when it comes to monogamous relationships because we kind of just use a default setting that's already there. So there isn't a need or a call for creative problem solving. And because you've got somewhat limitations around monogamy and what the solutions can be within that setup, yeah, you can get creative, but you're still hitting some walls. Whereas once you sort of step out of the monogamy structure and go into non-monogamy, now no default settings, now there's no structure, there's no preset rules. You're starting on a fresh new canvas, which I think, although it can be a little intimidating, at the same time, it also provides the space to go into this creative problem solving mode. And like you said, let's go to the drawing board. Like, let's just think in all the ways that we can figure it out and like brainstorm and then see what resources we have. Who do we know? Who are our friends? Who are, other partners? Who else can make this happen for you? Who they might know that can support you. Then doesn't end up being about you or me and whether it means that we still care for each other or love each other. But it then becomes like, here's a need, here's some ways here's like all the different ways that we can meet it. And let's like outsource, let's like go out to our extended network and see who can help us meet these needs.
Let me just say also the other end of that is, particularly if you're not entrenched in community, is that it can feel like free falling. That if you don't have the structure or the pre-prescribed rules of monogamy, and you say anything is possible, well, now that feels really big and overwhelming. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And what I'm excited to dive into today, and specifically, you're going to be joining us on Wednesday, July 29th, to do a workshop with us to actually give some stories and some examples and some tips and some strategies as resources for us to use, so that it is not a pre-prescribed set of rules for us, but instead, here are some models, here are some possibilities, here are some things to explore. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today, and we'll go into that more on the 29th. But I think that it's finding that, to your point, Effie, about finding community, it's finding stories, finding tips, finding strategies from within the community, so that you don't feel like you have to create it from scratch and reinvent the wheel and figure it out on your own.
Absolutely. It's the inspiration and permission piece that we work so hard on, So Steve is going to come on board and give us some inspiration on how we can handle this stuff. And also just permission to be creative, permission to think outside the box, permission to support and love one another in a way that really focuses on thriving. That's what we're going to talk about next week.
Yeah. I want to add in one quick little thing here about how when you're quarantining, it's not like we mentioned poly a lot in this context, and I primarily mention it because that's the backdrop that I'm coming from. But anyone can quarantine. This is not a poly specific thing. It just helps to have poly lingo when you're having these conversations. But you don't have to quarantine with people you're sleeping with. You can quarantine with your best friend. You can do it with your family. You can do it with another family because you just really want kids in your life and you're tired of being alone. And you can say like, hey, you need to get to work. I can engage in childcare. I get free rent because I'm quarantining with you. Like, we can go way into this, the beautiful configurations that we can create that solve our needs without even touching on anything really from the polyamorous world. It's simply people being people, having their needs met through creative configurations and relationships.
I think why that's important for me as a parent is that, so right now, New York City just announced that come September through June of 2021, children will be engaged in either all virtual or blended learning, meaning that they will only attend school maybe 2-3 days a week at most, and the rest of the time will be home. So up until this point in March, I was thinking, well, we just need to make it through June. And then as the summer approached, I said, okay, well, we just need to make it to September. And now as September approaching, I'm like, oh, there is no more. I just need to make it to, this is what life looks like, and how am I going to surround myself with people, with community, with resources to now help me through the next stage of of life, as opposed to what I was doing beforehand, which was like piecemealing things together just to make it through the next phase. And this next phase has no end in sight that we know. We don't know what that's going to look like. And so I appreciate what you're saying, Steve, that it's not just about being engaged in romantic or sexual relationships and figuring out how to meet those needs, but really understanding how to navigate life right now as we try to have childcare and go back to work and see families again. What does that look like, and how are we going to navigate through that?
One of the things I'm noticing is kind of what I've been looking a lot. So the polycules or even the QuaranTEAM is essentially a micro community, right? You're dealing with a micro community, and ideally you're looking at an interconnected, interdependent micro community of people that are gathering together under a common interest or a mission to take care of themselves and each other, right? This is essentially what we're looking at, which is what I always think of a polycule also. When I think of a polycule or a bunch of people who are romantically in a relationship, it's also a micro community. So this is really about how do you build community, which goes back to where, Steve, that's where you started from, right? As a community builder, we are now relying on that community building skills, which, by the way, is very human, right? We are actually evolved to be in communities. We know that our brains are programmed, are wired to hold on to about 150 meaningful connections, which was the nomadic tribal structure which we evolved into. And I feel like with this quarantine, the quarantining is going back to our roots, going back to the way that we evolved, where we're wired to create these interconnected, cooperative, and collaborative micro communities. So with that in mind, Steve, tell us, why do you think it would be a good idea to create a QuaranTEAM during this time?
Oh man, so many reasons. And for some people, these reasons could be the opposite of why they would want to do it. You could just spend more time with other people. And some people are like, oh, I just want to be alone. It's great being alone. But we can start off, let's bucket it into a couple different things. So financial reasons are a huge one. So imagine what happens even pre-pandemic. If you meet someone that you like, you enjoy their company, you can just leave your apartment, move in with them, and now you've gone from 2 rents to 1 rent. So right off the bat, moving in with another person already has pretty awesome perks. So being able to consolidate rent is a huge one. That also applies equally to insurance. So if you have either no insurance or crappy insurance, and you know someone with good insurance, and there's a domestic partner option within your state where you can, after spending a certain amount of time living with someone in their space, you can then qualify under domestic partnership provisions, potentially for their company. That could give them access to extending their insurance to you. And so that's yet another really compelling reason for all the people who've been kicked off their employer's insurance. Having domestic partners can be a really compelling way of saying, like, hey, this system is broken and is not serving us. We are struggling. We're going to take advantage of this. Beyond that, there's also food costs and food cleanup. So if you're anything like me, you've noticed that you have now begun making, I think my time spent on food prep has increased over 1,000%. I used to mostly eat out, occasional, like I'll have a bowl of cereal here and there, 1 or 2 dishes. Now I'm doing dishes for over an hour a day, and I'm prepping food minimum 2 hours a day. And it's a lot. And if you have other people you get to live with or quarantine with, suddenly you can begin sharing responsibilities. And that applies whether it's to dishes, it could be childcare, it could be general household chores. Pretty much across the board, when you have more people, you can distribute the responsibility more effectively. And you can also take advantage of comparative advantages. So if someone happens to really like dishes and someone else hates it, maybe that person would be more interested in doing yard work or taking out the trash. There's plenty of responsibilities to divvy up based on what people are comparatively better at or enjoy more. Let's see. On the financial side of things, there's also bulk ordering. So if you're thinking about, instead of going to a space where if you buy like one spinach bundle, it could be $4 at a Whole Foods or $8 at a Whole Foods, but you can get it at a local farmer's market for $2 for a pound. And things like that. You can get so much cost savings just by being able to order in greater quantities. And so depending on the size of your QuaranTEAM, you can certainly instantly begin seeing food cost reductions. And those are just a few on the economic frontier. There's obviously the social frontier. Some people are lonely, and the emotional tax that comes along with loneliness, it's already pre-pandemic, it was already an epidemic. Loneliness itself, people being isolated, feeling like they don't have a community, they don't have close friends. They certainly don't have very diverse friend groups. I think the average American has the average white American has fewer than 1 non-white friends. So there's plenty of opportunity in the context of building out your QuaranTEAM to incorporate a little more diversity of thought, of race, of profession, of skills into your new social milieu. And it's really powerful to be able to suddenly go from being alone to being part of something. And if you're part of it, not just a group of people who happen to want to live together, but if you're actually part of a community, like you said, these micro communities, I've seen friends who I can't even fathom how much progress they've made as individuals by virtue of living together. It's their chosen family. In one case, they were all into personal development. And so there's about 4 people, they moved in together into an apartment in Williamsburg. And every day they would hold each other accountable to like eating healthily, doing check-ins for emotional health, doing check-ins for productivity, doing co-working sessions, movie nights, bringing friends over so they can expand their entire social circles. Obviously now with the pandemic, the bringing friends over is harder, but the fact that you can now bring friends into your life on a much more serious basis, like you can actually live with them rather than just, video chatting them every once in a while or seeing them at the movies or at parks. Now you can actually have the option of living with the people that you actually enjoy spending time with. And that maybe if you were thinking about who do I want to become, who do I want to be more like, these are the people who now you can pitch QuaranTEAMing to. And if they're in a position of being open to it, if they're like a friend of mine who had a 4-bedroom apartment and 3 roommates left the city to go be with their families indefinitely, and she's on the hook for 3 additional bedrooms. That's a beautiful quarantine soup just getting ready. Like, there's 3 open rooms. She can pick anyone she wants to come live with her now. And there's a lot of people looking. There's people who are, they'd rather cut their rent in half or more, potentially get rid of rent entirely as a line item. And there's a lot of options for doing this right now. And I think I could go on, but I'll leave it. If there's any other areas that like you're particularly curious about, let's dive into it.
No, I think all of the things that you're saying are spot on. And I would even say for those people who like being alone, who are not able to be alone, I think a QuaranTEAM can actually facilitate that. So for example, I'll just use Jackie as an example. If somebody could just take her beautiful daughter off her hands for an hour and she can be alone, I think she would cherish that. So I think there are situations where being in a QuaranTEAM will actually enable you to spend some alone time that maybe previously you haven't been able to because you have childcare or you have a partner that kind of needs you, so you feel like you need to show up for them, and there isn't like any kind of downtime for your own time. So I think even though for those who like to be alone, QuaranTEAM can facilitate that.
I definitely want to chime in here because I love that you brought that up. My partner lived alone for over 1.5 years before we began quarantining. So she went from 1.5 years completely alone, no one stayed over, to suddenly I am with her 24/7, sleeping in the same bed. It's a 1-bedroom apartment. So boom, night and day. And so the fact that we have, and I didn't describe this earlier, we have a distributed QuaranTEAM. So we're not all under the same roof. We live in, I believe it's 4 separate apartments, but we each go to each other's shared spaces. And there's one space in particular that we're all able to go to together. And so we maintain our checks. We make sure that we're being safe and wearing masks the whole way through. And then when we get into the space that is shared, which we've all agreed, like this is the safe haven. Like we don't see outside people. We do see each other and we're safe with one another. Once we get into the shared apartment, that's when it's like, okay, go shower, get all of the outside world off of you. And from there, we can actually spend more quality time together. We'll do communal cooking. If I go alone to visit the other members of our QuaranTEAM, then my partner gets the entire evening or weekend to herself, and she can just read and literally do anything that she cares to do alone. And so there are huge benefits of quarantining, regardless of whether you leave your apartment or whether you have multiple people in the same apartment or distributed across multiple apartments.
So it's interesting, right? It makes sense. Actually, I should say, so I'm about to embark on a similar journey personally. So I'm about to move in with a good friend of mine, her husband and kid, and her husband's boyfriend and her boyfriend and myself. So it's like 5 adults. It's going to be 5 adults, 1 toddler, 1 dog, all going into a home together in the West Coast. So we're going to try this. We're going to try this out. We're relocating as a pod and see how that works out. So all the things that I'm hearing from you is just affirming right now. I'm like, we made the right decision. It's the right thing to do. But with that in mind, it is a massive change. It is a big commitment. There's a lot to think about and to consider. Can you give us some like headline things to consider when you are embarking on a journey like that? Especially in my situation, if we're all kind of going into a one big space together, and that's what people are deciding, or even in a distributed one like your QuaranTEAM. What are some of the things that should be considered before you make the move or before you merge?
So personally, I'm someone who's literally opened up Excel and made an Excel guide to just starting any relationship with any person. So when I think about what to consider, I really like to break it down into the granular of like, let's look at this on the time management frontier first. How do you prefer to spend your time? Are people mostly going to be out of the house? Are they going to be mostly 100% in the house? Are you going to be on the same Wi-Fi connection? Do you have enough Wi-Fi? Are you going to be, if you're multiple people speaking over one another during the workday? Like just basic logistics are one foundational principle of like making this decision. Logistically, will you be able to sustain this? Is there going to be a crying baby?
That's brilliant, by the way. Can we just pause there for a second and
Yes.
say how we joke about how I capture lots of things in my mind and how I'm a computer of resource, and that was something, Steve, that I did not until now, frankly, am now reevaluating. Like we were just making it work. Someone go to the bedroom, someone go to the basement, someone go in here. Like we were just, and now we're saying, oh, this is going to be our life long term. I should have had a conversation with you and talked about Wi-Fi and talked about conference calls and talked about, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes just the physical logistics of the space is what needs to be considered when you're thinking about venturing into this. So go on. I just needed to affirm yes to all those things.
Oh, hell yeah. It goes so much beyond that too, because I'll put it this way. Like when I was accepted into college, they gave me this multi-page sheet for deciding which roommate they should pair me with. It goes into things like, do you like to listen to music late at night? Do you like to entertain and bring people over? Do you like to have long-winded conversations about things? Do you like a lot of privacy? How much physical space do you need? Just dozens and dozens of questions just for a roommate. And then you think about the fact that I'm also making these for relationships. So do you need someone who aligns with you spiritually and philosophically and economically, and in terms of what you like doing for fun and how you like to live logistically in your space, sexually, romantically, emotionally? There's so many different dimensions on which we can or cannot align with others. And so to not take those into account prior to committing to spending a huge amount of time with a new person or a new group of people, and also to factor in all of the intricacies of how those different people, like it could be that you can live well with one, but if it's one plus the other two, then suddenly it becomes way more difficult, because you can have a really good bond and rapport with one particular member of your QuaranTEAM, and then the other ones may just be doing their own thing, and maybe you don't have the same rapport. Or if it's like a situation where, my poor college roommate, he was with someone, his actual roommate. This is like pre-quarantine, he had a roommate. Post-quarantine or mid-quarantine, the roommate is not respecting these rules. And he doesn't feel like he's in a position of power to just kick the roommate out, but he feels dramatically more unsafe because this roommate is taking flights, meeting people same day, and showing up with them back at the apartment. And my friend is just like, what? How is this okay? Where's my legal recourse for this person introducing nonstop risk into my dynamic here? I don't feel safe in my own apartment. And that's not even like a chosen QuaranTEAM. That's simply the roommate that he happened to have at the time. So when you're choosing a QuaranTEAM, it's actually really important to know our basic understandings of personal safety and how we wear masks, for instance, how often we get tested or checked, what ways in which we engage with others. What is someone who is considered safe? If they say, yeah, I saw 2 friends today, but they were both, already quarantined for 2 weeks, and it's like, okay, seems more reasonable. If they say, I met 2 people off of Tinder today, then you might say, wait, hold up. What do you know about them? Is this okay? You have now just introduced 2 huge risk vectors into our dynamic. And if we are a 5-person QuaranTEAM, that simply is not acceptable. Unless we say, we don't care about our health at all. We'll do anything. We just happen to live together. It's up to you to define these rules. And I think that's where we really come into the backdrop in poly and kink, where defining the rules up front, the rules of engagement, that's just par for the course. Because if you don't do that, then it's leaving open so many vectors of risk and of danger and of just unmet expectations. So I think having a really good grounding in what are the questions that you want to be asking one another, and on what dimensions are you going to be considering life together. I think that's becomes so important when you're making this decision, because you are really, this is a relationship. It has all of the weight of any other relationship in your life, whether romantic or sexual or a friendship or a roommate relationship. Like all of these kind of interplay, especially Effie, it sounds like there's people who are intimately engaged in your QuaranTEAM. So dealing with that, how do we handle date nights? Because there might be multiple configurations within our QuaranTEAM of people who want to go on date nights. And if you see other people, what's the policy for how we, self-isolate afterward to ensure that the rest of our team is safe?
Absolutely. There's so much to consider. And yes, it's very much the way that we think in the kink and the poly community. One of the things when you're sort of saying, the thing that comes up for me is this idea of a risk tolerance, which I talk a lot about. The risk tolerance is a tolerance, which means that it's different for everyone, right? The classic example I give is some people won't cross an empty road on a red light while other people jump out of planes, right? that's your range of risk tolerance, and everything in the middle. And until and it's one of the core things, whether you're quarantining or about to get into a kinky scene with someone, you need to make sure that your risk tolerance is aligned, that you're willing to take the same risks, and then you feel comfortable around the same benchmark for risk and what's okay and what's not okay. And I think it's not something that we would normally negotiate with people, in a regular sort of mononormative relationship. You wouldn't, it's not something that you even comes up, in that kind of clear way. And it definitely comes up in, if you're doing any kind of kinky play with anyone, and it has to come up when you're doing something like a QuaranTEAM. Similarly, knowing yourself and knowing what's important to you. So one of the conversations that I know we had to have is like, my domestic environment has a direct impact on my mental health. Like I struggle with ADD. It's heavily managed, and it's managed through somewhat of a vigilant control over my space. Like everything has a place, everything in its place. If I don't do that, it's lost forever. Like I have no working memory, right? So for me, a domestic environment is directly correlated to anxiety management, right? And productivity management. Whereas I know the people that I'm moving in with, for them, it does not bother them at all. Like whatever the environment that they're in, it doesn't have an impact on them like it has on me. So you need to also understand what you need and what's important to you, and express that, and make sure that it is, even if it's not important to the other people, they understand that it's important to you and why it's important to you.
That even it ties in pretty quickly with the economic frontier. And I'll explain why. I recently noticed that we had ants coming into our apartment, and my partner's just like, yeah, they're here sometimes. And I'm like, I would prefer that there not be ants crawling up my legs and on my laptop as I'm recording podcasts and doing my day-to-day life. And she's like, oh, I just never really noticed. I guess like maybe they're here, maybe they're not. And I said, well, I would like to invest in this shared expense of finding ways of dealing with this. Both it's the shared time cost of like problem solving, but also the shared financial cost of potentially finding some sort of, I don't know, ant removal system. I don't know what that looks. And this is not just tied to specifically ants. This can apply to anything that suddenly becomes a shared cost. You have to know, how do you deal with this? How do you decide which things are actually shared? I bought a personal massage gun because I was like, oh, massages aren't going to be a thing for a long time because we can't just go to practitioners as readily. We don't feel as safe. And so I bought a massage gun, and the question was, is this a shared expense because we're both going to be using it? And if we're quarantining for a year versus 2 months, should it still be a shared expense? Who gets to take it in the end? These kinds of things, like they begin to accumulate very quickly. What are the shared costs? Like we went and got halal the other day, halal food from a cart. And that was like is that a split food cost if we're sharing it? Or is one of us going to cover it? Like this kind of happens it happens on first dates. It happens in relationships where you're cohabitating, and it happens in a QuaranTEAM. Because as you begin sharing resources and sharing responsibilities, you then also have to deal with shared costs. And the costs are not necessarily shared equally. Maybe someone is way better off financially and says, I want to front rent, but I never want to touch dishes. And that can be completely great. If someone could have a rent-free living and all they have to do is dishes, they'd be like, 100%, I'll do all the chores. This is amazing. Now I can just focus on my creative pursuits and never have to worry about rent. And so that's certainly an option that you can negotiate your way into, but it does require so much negotiation and so much talking across all of the different members. And just as a relationship, especially in poly, like it gets more complex the more members you add. Same with a QuaranTEAM, because you have all of your everything, your preferences, every little piece of your life that now has to become split with another person. What then happens when you tack on the third person? Because it's not just you, person 2 and person 3, it's you and person 2, you and person 3, and then person 2 and person 3. Like this, the math equation grows quickly, because then when you have 4, it's an exponential curve. So you just actually, with each additional person you bring in, you have to recognize the communication will have to also exponentiate.
Can we talk a little bit about that? I'm interested, Steve, if you have any tips around how to have these conversations or how to have these negotiations. So Effie is in a situation where she has lived on her own and is now going to be entering into a QuaranTEAM and moving in across the country with each other, setting up new space. I have been in some ways living a quarantine life for almost 2 years now, where there are these three households that are important in this grouping. So I have one partner where I live with myself and my daughter, another where it's just the two of us, and then my daughter is also has share space with her father. So we split custody. And so within these three homes, we all see each other at different points and in different configurations. And so that part of it felt natural to us around the sharing the space and sharing the resources. Where the conversation started to become more tricky was when one of my partners wanted to start dating someone else. My other partner wanted to start working again and going into the city to go into work. My ex-husband wanted to start playing softball and, and spending time with friends. And now having conversations around how do we introduce these new folks? What does that look like in terms of safety? What is possible and not possible? Because we understand that whatever decision you make is actually impacting all of us and all of the people who we will now be interacting with. And for a community where polyamory, part of that is rooted in autonomy, it started to feel confining. You're telling me who I can see, when I can see them, if they should get tested, if I should go to work, if I can play softball. And, none of us want rules. Some of us can barely deal with, some guidelines and expectations. And so I'm wondering if you have figured out or worked with folks around how to better navigate through some of these dialogues.
Honestly, this is probably the trickiest part of all of quarantining, because as you add more people and any new vectors, whether it be a new space or a partner's partner, or for instance, if your child's father decided that he wanted to date elsewhere or go and behave in a more risky way, but you're still quarantining on occasion with your child, suddenly the child becomes a new vector for possible contagion if the father's not being as safe, and you don't have control over that because they're not really part of your core quarantine, and everyone else in your quarantine is like, what's going on here? Like, how do we get this other independent person to make quote unquote better decisions that show more respect? It really does bring us back to maybe the rule of communities of 150, because as the community size expands, it's so much harder to get buy-in from people, to have them share the same values, the same sense of respect, the same desire to see everyone's needs fulfilled. And this is definitely the biggest thing to factor in when you're contemplating a quarantine, is what happens as you begin to scale up a little bit, as you begin to introduce these new vectors of risk. It's just, if you really have strict preferences, and it's hard enough to live with yourself, it could be that much harder living with another person, with multiple other people. At the end of the day, I think my best recommendation is to come up with really effective systems of communication that allow people to freely air what it is that's coming up that's problematic for them or that they're worried about, and then be able to have a space where they know they can be heard. So like with my partner, when we moved in together, we didn't know exactly what would be coming up. It was a spur of the moment decision. It's like, oh, there's a pandemic. I need to leave this apartment because there are Airbnb guests all the time. This is not acceptable. And so we just moved in together without really knowing a lot of what would then come up. And we had to quickly build out those systems to be able to better communicate with one another. And so one of our first rules was, anytime you notice something that makes you feel even the slightest bit off, bring it up as soon as you can. If you can bring it up in real time, do it. If you bring up 5 things in a row in the middle of a workday, then let's queue it up for an evening time. We'll check in and just say, hey, what did you notice today? You can do it monthly, you can do it weekly, you can do it daily, depending on just the flow of your lives. But being able to present the things that are making you uncomfortable or feeling unsafe or feeling unheard, being able to present that in a regular and safe manner is extremely powerful, because then you've operationalized problem solving within your dynamic in a way that allows you to not leave things on the back burner, not leave things up to creative interpretation. Practicing, my partner and I literally took a course on mindful speech because we thought that would be it's a combination of like Buddhist teachings, but also nonviolent communication practices. So doing that together has helped us begin changing the way that we talk to one another. It's not so much like, you did this and it made me feel this way. It's more, we learn some of the practices around, hey, can I bring up something that I've been noticing that's been making me feel a little weird, and I want to just create a space where we can talk through it. There's a gentleness to the communication, and it leads to just so much more effectiveness, because then we can actually talk about the real thing that's the problem, rather than skirting around the issues, rather than faulting one another when we may not have even known what was happening that was wrong or upsetting.
Also, when we did the podcast recording for your new podcast series, Steve, one of the things that you brought up, and I love that how you liken relationships to co-founding startups, right? It's the analogy that you use, which I love, and I think some of it is also you kind of need to approach this stuff with the pragmatism of co-founding. Not all the time, but especially when you're figuring out logistics, especially when you're having these intentional conversations where you're going to extract out of that conversation new agreements that you're going to live by or decisions that need to be made. Those are can be handled way more effectively with a bit more of a pragmatic approach, where you almost kind of remove yourself. That essentially you're not taking things personally, right? You're saying, here's the situation, you're acknowledging the situation, you're acknowledging the people in it, and you're kind of going towards decisions and problem solving and agreements and very sort of processing in that processing mode. I think then when you can put your co-founder hat on or co-CEO hat on and approach it in that way, I also think that you probably become more effective in getting those things nailed.
I totally agree. I think one of my favorite things about that startup approach is that it does give you a model that's been practiced now for decades of what happens when you have multiple co-founders, multiple people trying to steer the ship, multiple people who have a vested equity stake in what's happening here. And while a lot of people do have experience with monogamous relationships where you just have one co-founder, essentially, it really does help when you're building a QuaranTEAM of more than two to have a little bit more background and insight from the startup world, where it's completely common to have co-founder size of 1, of 2, of 3, of 4, of 5. After 5, it gets a little dicey. It can still work, but once you're splitting equity that much, it can be a little bit harder to make sure everyone's on board. But I'd say up to a size of 5 is like a pretty solid and normal thing within the startup world to be able to negotiate through that. And some people may bear more responsibility than others, but in each case, as you come on, you're committing to these agreements. You're saying, this is the shared vision we have of where we want to take this company all together. And based on what everyone is willing and able to contribute, this is how we'd like to apportion equity. This is how we'd like to apportion responsibilities. And you may have different roles. Like you can be a co-founder and head of marketing, and then have your friend be a co-founder and head of sales, head of business development, head of product. And so you can still have roles within your dynamic that do not distract from the fact that you're still a vested partner in this. And I think there's something really beautiful about just the way that startups will go about solving these problems. Like, hey, market forces change. That's the nature of being a startup. And so just as, your child's father changes his behavior in a way that suddenly means I have to go back to my QuaranTEAM and say, hey, market forces have changed. We have a new variable. So what do we do about this now? It's not like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Like, how dare you let him do that? That's not the conversation. The conversation is a much more respectful, like, hey, I'm bringing this to all of our attention because I just found out about it. This is something that I think is important for all of us to be able to work through together and decide on. So I want to call an all hands, get everyone together and say, what is our best approach? And have everyone air, like, what are the things that worry you most about this? What is our actual set of true risks that we're dealing with, and how do we mitigate them in the best way we can?
I love that analogy of market forces changing. And I love coming back to the team with the spirit, as you said, Effie, too, of collaboration and saying, okay, this is what's happening. Now, what are we going to do? Let's dialogue about it. I think that's beautiful.
Right, exactly. And I think it's also important because the state that you're going into that discussion is different. Like to be able to step out of the romanticized part of the relationship, but going into in a pragmatic, practical way, that state change is also helpful, I think, towards the relationships. And by the way, I would say if you're not able to do that with your group, you might want to, let me say this and see what you think. See, I would say is if you're not able to do that with your group, you might not have gathered the right group, would be my guess. What are your thoughts on that?
There is the fact of, like, if people actively feel unsafe, it is always their prerogative to be able to opt out. Just as you're like an at-will employee at a startup, you can leave. As a co-founder, you can relinquish your equity and walk. This is always an option. It may not be your favorite option or the best option, but it is always an option. And just as startups can shift out their co-founders, shift out their employees, anytime that it makes sense for the startup as a whole, that same thing can happen in a QuaranTEAM. Like, you can ask one of your members to leave if that is what is agreed upon as like the best course of action. And there are certainly ways of doing that are better than others. Like, give someone fair warning, give them second chances, lead with empathy and consideration for what their available alternatives are, but also hold people accountable to respecting the standards that need to be shared in order for you all to feel healthy and safe together. And so if there is a situation where someone is simply not, maybe they're reading different news from you, maybe they're saying, hey, masks aren't important, I'd rather not wear them outside. And then everyone in your QuaranTEAM is saying, how is this okay? Like, in those cases, maybe it comes down to a vote. Maybe it comes down to a checking in with everyone and collective, like there's different systems of voting for this. I can turn to, I believe there's a system within, I want to say Denmark, where you sit together in the same room until you have a compromise, no matter how long it takes. You do not leave until and so it kind of forces everyone to find creative solutions here. And that's one way of doing it. You can set a timer, hope that you can come to a solution within that time. I think improv is a really healthy thing to learn from in this time, because there are so many unknowns and there's so many new things coming out where it shifts the dynamic, it shifts the equation. Having a background in improv gives you the ability to say, oh, new information, let's see how I can respond. It's a yes and approach to anything new that comes in. So you say, oh, they're not wearing a mask. Okay, and what? And what do we do from here? What are our options? It's not saying, oh my God, this is terrible. I can't, like, you're removing that additional confusion and frustration of simply emoting at someone or being persistently frustrated. And instead you quickly turn to, okay, new information. What do we do with this? How do we work with this? How do we factor this into what we already know to be true?
There's a great quote from a book called The Biggest Bluff by a woman called Maria Konnikova. And in there, she's essentially somebody who went to learn high stakes poker to understand decision making. This is what the book is about. And it's she can't even do basic maths is where she started, but she wanted to understand decision making process. And she found out, though, she realized that this poker was a really good simulation for life and decision making. And one of the things that she says in the book is life is a game of incomplete information, which is what poker is, right? You know what you know and the things that you don't know, and then you take a chance on. So essentially that you're dealing with that. Life is a game of incomplete information. You make decisions the best of what you know with what you see. You make some guesses, you hedge some bets and cross your fingers,
I hate that quote. That sounds terrible.
Not knowing. Jackie's like, what do you mean you don't know everything?
See, I prefer Steve's spreadsheet to not knowing. I'm like, that's terrible, not knowing what the thing is. Yeah. No, but I think that that's fair. And I think that's why I think I really, I'm going to be using now this, the market has changed, or this idea of that you can prepare for what you know and really should be thoughtful and intentional about preparing for what you know, and understand that dynamics will change and things will change and people will change, and be prepared to have that conversation, to your point, Steve, with empathy, with grace, with clarity. And so I think that it sounds like that's the best that we can do, is prepare for what we know and show up to what we don't know with some amount of care and love for the people that we are with.
And a little curiosity too. Like, if you think about the same application within the kink community, is there are risks. If you're suspending someone from a harness or from being tied up at their ankles, and then you're putting needles through their nipples, there are things that people will do that come with clear risks. And what do we do to mitigate those risks? We sanitize first. Sometimes it's the exact same things. We'll sanitize. We'll wear masks, whether in kink or in COVID. We still wear them. It could be a ball gag. It could be a full-headed latex mask. It depends. But we assess the risks, and then we take the necessary precautions before moving forward. And then we can move forward with relative confidence because we've done the work of assessing our risks and making sure that everyone's on board, everyone is behaving in a safe, sane, consensual way. It's just, that's part of the dynamic that we carry over from these other worlds, whether it be kink or poly. And if you're coming from even a background in public health, I'd love to quarantine with someone who has a background in epidemiology. Maybe not for the fact that they keep chiming in with additional like risk factors that we didn't realize were there before. It might get really sad over time. But at the very least, you can think about your quarantine in terms of where are our relative skills? Who are the people we need in this space to feel safe? Maybe it would help to have a doctor on hand. I feel like doctors would be potentially either really good or really bad for a quarantine. They're good if they're just a doctor who's maybe retired and not actively in a hospital. Like, I don't know that I would want to quarantine right now with someone who's going to a hospital every day. And it sucks because I hate the idea that first responders and healthcare workers might be considered not fit for a quarantine because of their work. And it's really unfortunate that that may be the case for a lot of people, that they're too high a risk profile for the quarantine that they might otherwise want to be part of. And that's ultimately, I would trust the doctors in my life to be able to inform me as best they can about what they believe their risk level to be relative to other people that I could be quarantining with. And so at the end of the day, trust your experts, talk to people, ask all of the questions that you need to ask to feel safe and comfortable.
Exactly. And also, I just want to put in there, I think there's a misconception that people with high risk tolerances are irresponsible by design. I want to sort of separate those two things. You can have a high risk tolerance, right? You could be the person that jumps out of a plane, but that doesn't automatically mean you're irresponsible. In fact, people who jump out of planes are some of the most responsible people. Those packs get checked a million times. They're actually taking a lot of precautions, knowing what the risks are. And I think this is the same here. You don't necessarily need to be with people with the lowest risk tolerance. You just want to be with people that are the same risk tolerance as you and are responsible around the risk that they're willing to take. I think that's the sort of the way to look at it in a way.
Yeah, I would say my favorite person to turn to when it comes to assessing risks is my friend who's an astronaut doctor, because he literally has to think about what could possibly go wrong in space. Like, he has to assess every possible risk from every possible angle. And when he sees someone whose hand is 5 times the size it should be, and they're in the space station and he's on the ground saying like, okay, what do we do with this? How do we take new information? The market has changed. This person's hand is probably going to kill them if we don't do something immediately. So it's really fascinating to see inside his mind, because he's also now living in Manhattan and working in the ER because he's volunteering his time to ensure that people remain safe and healthy through COVID. So he's someone who will very clearly say, hey, before I move in with you, here's the risk that you should be thinking about, because these are the ones endemic to like my profession. These are my otherwise potentially risky behaviors, if any, that I'm engaged in. And here's like what I assess as being how relatively risky it is.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about. This thing is not easy. I think, okay, let me put it this way. I think it's definitely worth going down the quarantine path for many reasons. I think we are built that way. We thrive in micro communities as people, most of us. You just have to find the right configuration for you. Also, the benefits really are clear. The things that you talked about, financial, social, physical, there's so many benefits. And I do think it's worth exploring. And I want to say it is hard. It's not going to be something that you're just going to be able to like click your fingers and make it happen. It's going to take work, but I think ultimately it's going to be worth it.
And what I think is interesting about the formula that you are sharing too, Steve, is that it doesn't necessarily mean moving in with each other. In the example that you gave of right now, your QuaranTEAM are in different apartments. It could be a group of friends who do live on their own, but decide that we are going to only see each other so that we can have community, that we will see each other together, or just 2 of us, or that we will see each other, whatever that looks like, but that we as a group are making decisions about how we can have connection and be safe together, even if there's still autonomy, even if we're still living solo. So I love all of the different ways in which what you're proposing can manifest itself based on the type of community that you want to have and create.
Yeah, I want to even add on top of that, because I just encountered just in the last couple of weeks a new form. It's not a QuaranTEAM per se, but it's one that I think is more accessible to us than we think, safer than we think, and way more nourishing than we could have possibly expected. So I'll describe it as like a Sesame Street style QuaranTEAM. So there's a space up the street from where I live, and it's on a street corner It's a little ledge that you can see the sunset from this ledge, and you can have approximately 6 people distanced 6 feet apart across this ledge and like within the general vicinity of it. It's removed from the sidewalk, so it's really easy to be able to see people coming by. They can see you. They can choose to approach or not. But what's been happening is this emergent community of locals who simply like watching the sunset, and they'll bring their dogs. You'll be able to see people on a regular, like we literally call it sunsets at the wall, because if you show up at sunset, you'll see people in your local community and you actually get to hang out with them, and you can maintain social distance. You can wear your masks, you can pet dogs, you can get to see like what's going on in their lives. I've seen people giving dating advice. I've seen people talking about racism and how to deal with police. I've seen people talking about just general life circumstances and friends who are going through tough shit and don't really know how to work through it. And then others who are from the community present at the wall will give advice and hold space. And it's just such a beautiful nascent thing to have emerged in the middle of this just grassy area in the middle of New York. And it's something that even if you don't have or don't want your personal QuaranTEAM, you can still find community in other ways that can still be socially distanced and safe. And even if you have a QuaranTEAM, like I have one, and I still go to sunsets at the wall because it's people in the neighborhood. It's people who I otherwise would not talk to or would not have a chance to talk to. And because they're just showing up consistently, bringing their dogs so the dogs can have some social energy and play around, it's a really cathartic environment. And it's one that even if you don't want to personally QuaranTEAM, you can still find and create these little blips of community and conviviality in your local neighborhood.
Amazing. And that to me is so human. It's just what humans eventually we are pack animals. We are, even amongst a pandemic, we find ways to connect and be a community. And if you want to take a deep dive into how you prepare yourself physically, emotionally, and logistically for this next phase of the quarantine, with a special focus on how to build a QuaranTEAM made up of friends, lovers, and/or chosen family, join us on Wednesday, July 29th. Steve will be walking us through how to maintain sanity while stuck at home alone, decide whether a full-time QuaranTEAMing is right for you versus just inviting friends over on occasion, how to choose members for your QuaranTEAM, conversational scripts for discussing QuaranTEAMing with friends, family, and partners, logistics and armchair economics of QuaranTEAMing, nerdy but fun, personal stories from successful QuaranTEAMs, best practices for nurturing relationships, even if you choose to continue QuaranTEAMing alone. Tickets are available on our Facebook page, in our Instagram bio, on our website by searching We Are Curious Foxes.
And to find out more about Steve Dean and his work, visit dateworking.com, dateworking.com. And you can follow us at We Are Curious Foxes on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon. If you're a Patreon member, then you will have access to not only the workshop that Steve has done with us about dating, but if you can't make it on July 29th, then you will have access to be able to see the workshop that Steve is doing on QuaranTEAMing. We can find all of our previous workshops, both virtual and in person, there on Patreon. You have opportunities to ask Effie questions once a month about things that you may be struggling with. You have opportunities to join us for monthly events and socials and so much more. Visit us on Patreon at We Are Curious Foxes. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, we want to say thank you. We have just hit 16,000 downloads for the Curious Fox podcast. We are thrilled about it. If you've been enjoying this podcast and the others, then we ask you to like and review and share it. It really makes a difference. Our goal here is to hashtag change the noise so that you can hear stories of thriving and be given permission and inspiration to find ways to both be curious and challenge the status quo in love, sex, and relationships. And if you have questions that you would like to explore on the show, then you should give us a call and we may play your question and answer it in one of our upcoming episodes. You can call us at 201-870-0063. And as always, you can reach out to us to share your ideas, tell us which episodes helped you in your journey, or just let us know that you're listening by emailing us at listening@wearecuriousfoxes.com.
And until next time, friends, stay curious. Curious Fox Podcast is not and will never be the final word on any topic. We solely aim to encourage curiosity and provide a space for exploration through connection and story. We encourage you to listen with an open and curious mind, and we'll look forward to your feedback. Stay curious, friends.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.
Stay curious.